Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel. Today I'm going to be doing something quite different from the name statistics series that we just concluded last time. I'm going to be talking about minimalism in the argument for the resurrection. I talk about this a lot on Facebook. I have a 3-part series on my objections to the minimal facts argument. And some people think I'm obsessed with it. Please notice all the time I've just been putting into defending Richard Bauckham and the name statistics argument over the past 14 weeks. But I came across something recently that's very relevant to my concerns about minimalism, and it was something I didn't know before, and I thought it would be good to make a video of it. I'm also planning to read a pretty long excerpt here from a book by a liberal biblical scholar named Norman Perrin from a book in the 1970s, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to then get a high quality transcript of this video, which will help me to transcribe Perrin's work because it's not available in a way that's easy to cut and paste, and I'd like to have a word processed version of these excerpts to back up what I'm saying. A big concern that I have with minimalism broadly conceived is the representation of what more liberal scholars, skeptical scholars grant or accept, which confuses people into thinking that they grant something that's more useful than what they really do grant. And then these are aggregated, these scholars, all these different people grant the appearance fact, and then some statement is made like, this vast majority of 90+% of all scholars across the spectrum of ideology. In one place, Gary Habermas says something like, all scholars with any historical credibility, or some phrase like that, grant the appearance fact that the disciples had appearance experiences of Jesus after his resurrection. And I want to point out that this type of aggregating and this type of assimilating of very liberal scholars to granting this fact is something that you encounter even in William Lane Craig, even though he doesn't view himself as doing strictly a minimal facts argument. So that's why I said minimalism in the broader sense. And I'm not going to go right now into the differences between Craig's argument and the minimal facts argument. There are some differences, but it shares what we might call DNA with the minimal facts argument, in that Craig as well is often trying to say, especially with this appearance fact, that someone like Gerd Ludemann acknowledges the appearance fact, or as we'll be reading today, Norman Perrin, admits the appearance fact, and then somehow it's just the explanation of the fact that is that is controversial. And I think that's a confusing way to think of it. And I'm saying this as an epistemologist. As an epistemologist, I really like people to listen. I hate to have to sort of wave around my credentials, but it's not just credentials, it's my actual work in issues like independence, granting for the sake of the argument. I just published a paper on that. Epistemic entanglement, and all kinds of things like that. The issue I want to bring up today, I've mentioned in other videos. In epistemology, what we say is, quite rightly, you need to conditionalize on the most specific, relevant version of a proposition that you have, a piece of evidence that you have. The one that's the most relevant to the conclusion you're going to draw. Okay, the most specific one that's relevant to the conclusion you're going to draw. And so it's illegitimate to go to a soft focus in order to state some piece of evidence in a way that makes it seem helpful to your conclusion, even though you actually know something at a sharper focus level that would make that way less helpful to your conclusion, or even negatively relevant to your conclusion. So I'm just going to give a simple example here. Suppose that you want to argue for some reason that the winning number in a drawing of numbers from, let's say 1 to 20 was 10. So you're going to argue that the winning number was 10. That's your conclusion. And let's suppose that you have someone who, witnessed the drawing and says to you the winning number was 6. Now, rightly construed, that person's most specific version of what he actually says is negatively relevant to your desired conclusion. If the winning number, there can only be one winning number, and if it's 6, it's not 10. Okay? So he's actually testifying against your desired conclusion. But suppose you did this. Suppose you said, he grants, so-and-so has said that the winning number was more than 5. He grants the more than 5 fact, and that's positively relevant to the proposition that the winning number is 10, because, out of the 20 possibilities, we've just, cut out 5 of them, moving upward, moving the possibilities upward. That's wrong. You shouldn't do that. That's obviously an illicit use, because you know that the person said specifically that it was 6. Okay? Now that's just a simple example, but I believe that there is a deep misunderstanding and lack of understanding of this when it comes to citing scholars as granting the appearance fact. Is not something that even seemed at all like Jesus was risen. In many of these cases, Ludemann is an example, and Perrin, I'm going to document extensively today, is another example. Please notice, my objection is not that they don't think Jesus was really there, they don't think Jesus really rose from the dead. And people will characterize my concern that way, and then they'll go, well, duh, they're skeptics, That's not my objection. My concern is that they don't mean by appearances something that's helpful to the resurrection conclusion, the conclusion that Jesus was really raised bodily from the dead. They literally mean something like the person saying that the winning number was 6. They mean something that, if that were really what they experienced, would be negatively relevant in many cases, or at least would be extremely unhelpful and open to a lot of other interpretations. In this case, I'm going to say, in Perrin's case, definitely would be negatively relevant if what happened were what he thinks happened. And I'm speaking here in terms of the phenomenology of the disciples' experience, even what it seemed like. It didn't even seem to them that something was happening that they would then be very reasonable in interpreting as a bodily resurrection. And this also means that you don't have to invoke hallucinations to explain the appearance fact as Perrin means it. This is really important. Okay, I'm going to read a quotation from a post on the resurrection by William Lane Craig. I'm going to link to it in my video description, and I'm going to give some context from Craig so that I don't seem to be misrepresenting Craig. All right. This is Dr. Craig. So what should we conclude from this? Well, you can dismiss the appearances as hallucinations if you want to, but you cannot deny that the events themselves actually occurred. The late New Testament critic of the University of Chicago, Norman Perrin, puts it this way, quote from Perrin, "The more we study the tradition with regard to the appearances, the firmer the rock begins to appear upon which they are based." Close quote from Perrin, close quote from Craig. Now, I want to emphasize, later in the same post, Dr. Craig does something that unfortunately Dr. Habermas doesn't always do. Dr. Craig explicitly says that what he's given so far, which includes the reference here to Perrin, doesn't address whether the appearances were physical or not. So that's good that he acknowledges that. That's an important disambiguation that he does. I want to give credit for that. Nonetheless, I really want you to think about the impression given by what he does write. So first of all, he immediately juxtaposes dismissing the appearances as hallucinations, which you can do, quote unquote, if you want to, with the Perrin quote. This implies, or at least it's very naturally taken to imply, that to explain the quote unquote events themselves that even Perrin cannot deny would require some strained hypothesis like elaborate hallucinations. Sometimes people will even say group hallucinations. And that's not true. We're going to talk about what Perrin actually means here, and you wouldn't even need to invoke hallucinations. You could easily dismiss the resurrection while admitting what Perrin, quote unquote, cannot deny, and you wouldn't even need to invoke anything weird or esoteric like hallucinations. All right, and then another implication here is this phrase, the events themselves, that there is some event that it's reasonable to refer to univocally as appearances that, the different scholars who acknowledge the appearances are all talking about the events themselves. But what we find when we read Perrin in context is that he's definitely not talking about the same events. That he's not even talking about, I would say, the same events that Dale Allison is talking about. And I think Dale Allison acknowledges only events that are fairly readily explained and even perhaps better explained as paranormal, because even Allison thinks that the stuff like about Jesus eating and being normally present to these people all at once and so forth are later additions, but at least he thinks something kind of, vision-y happened to them that you're going to need some kind of a weird explanation for. Perrin doesn't even go that far. So that's not even univocal, okay? And certainly not if you get an evangelical scholar who tries to describe what it seemed like to the disciples and what kind of events seemed to them to be happening. Perrin's definitely not even talking about that. So if we call the events themselves the resurrection appearance experiences of the Gospels, there is not a univocal meaning. There isn't one set of events themselves. So Perrin is definitely doing the equivalent of saying the number was 6. And then, unfortunately, when you try to assimilate him to a consensus that the appearances happened, you're doing the equivalent of saying, he acknowledges that the number was more than 5, and then you're going to use that to support, the conclusion that it's 10, or that Jesus was raised from the dead. Whereas Perrin's really saying something that points away from a bodily resurrection. I really want to hammer that home. Okay, and notice, you cannot deny that the events themselves, how impressive this sounds. The more we study the tradition with regard to the appearances, the firmer the rock begins to appear upon which they are based. I mean, like, Perrin's giving you nothing when you look at the context. So, I'm going to be getting his book here, and I'm going to be reading you some excerpts. You can check this book out from what's called Open Library. You can check it out for 14 days, and I'll try to return it before I publish this. And then you can just read through it electronically. It's a pretty cool feature that they have. And so I'll try to put the link there. Now, Perrin goes through only the synoptic gospels in this one. You can pretty much imagine what he'd say about John based on what he says about the synoptics, but he's very definite that the appearance descriptions in Matthew and Luke they're not even intended to be historical. He's very clear about that. They're intended by them. He even talks about their intentions to teach theological truths. They're made up, in other words. He's very explicit about the physical aspects as being made up, like that to try to distinguish this from a Hellenistic non-bodily thing. They made up that Jesus could eat. They made up that Jesus said he was not a ghost and so forth. Very, very clear. And so he just dismisses that completely. So then he has a conclusion where he's interested in the question, what actually happened? He actually uses that phrase. And this is kind of important because you get to find out, what Perrin thinks actually happened. Now, he puts this huge emphasis upon Paul's so-called creed in 1 Corinthians 15, and it's kind of this almost Pavlovian thing that when you find a liberal scholar who acknowledges, which Perrin does, that this creed was part of 1 Corinthians and it was written, about the year 55, then your minimalist just gets all excited, like, oh boy, he acknowledges the creed in 1 Corinthians 15. But what Perrin does with it is really crazy. All right. Let me just read you some Perrin after talking about the creed and the appearances. First of all, the empty tomb tradition is comparatively late. There's no evidence for any such tradition earlier than the Gospel of Mark, itself written some 40 years after the event. Scholars are coming increasingly to the conclusion that the empty tomb tradition is an interpretation of the event, a way of saying Jesus is risen, rather than a description of an aspect of the event itself. So he's explicitly denying the empty tomb. But the matter is very different with regard to the appearances. The more we study the tradition with regard to the appearances, the firmer the rock begins to appear upon which they are based. There's the quote that Dr. Craig used. The most important thing, goes on Perrin, is that we have the actual testimony of Paul himself. He lists himself as one to whom the risen Christ has appeared, and there are places in his letters where he talks about this experience, albeit somewhat reluctantly. And he says there are 4 places. There's ... here. Why was Paul reluctant? All right. The first of these places is the one I have already quoted, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, where Paul includes himself in the list of those to whom the risen Lord had appeared. The importance of this for our immediate purpose is that it shows that Paul equates the appearance to himself with the appearances to Cephas, Peter, the 12, and others. He thought of himself as having experienced an appearance of the risen Lord just as they had. This is going to be very important to Perrin's argument, because what he's going to say is, we don't know. The other disciples experienced what Paul experienced. Okay, so he's really going to push on that they didn't experience anything more than what Paul experienced. And here's where, the idea that the gospel narratives with their physical details are just made up, they're just legendary, is pretty important. He's going to assimilate it all to what Paul experienced, but it gets worse because Perrin is now going to downgrade even what Paul experienced. In this connection, it is perhaps important to remind ourselves quite deliberately to ignore Luke's 3 accounts of the appearance to Paul on the Damascus Road in Acts 9, 21, and 26. These are somebody else's accounts of what happened to Paul, not Paul's own, and like all the narratives in the Gospels and in the Acts of the Apostles, they are didactic, designed to make theological points rather than historical, designed to recount what actually happened. But in the case of Paul's letters, we have his own words on the subject. So notice that even when something is attributed to Paul's own words in Acts, Perrin denies that it's something Paul actually said. We must remind ourselves to ignore it. All right? Now he's going to talk about what he considers to be the only good evidence of what really happened to Paul or to the other apostles. In addition to the listing of his experience of the risen Lord in 1 Corinthians 15:8 is Paul's reference to this event in Galatians 1:15 through 16. But when he who set me apart before I was born and had called me through his grace was pleased to reveal his Son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. And then there's a ... in Perrin. This is in the context of a passionate defense by Paul of his right to be considered an apostle and of his right to pursue and preach the gospel as he understands it, a gospel which, quote, came through a revelation of Jesus Christ, unquote, Galatians 1:12. So Perrin takes this to be Paul's description of what happened to him. God was pleased to reveal his Son to me, a revelation of Jesus Christ. A third reference in Paul's letters is found in a similar context of defense of his apostleship, and for this we return to 1 Corinthians 9:1 through 2. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? The fourth and last reference is more reflective in nature, being found in one of the best known and most loved passages in Paul's letters, Philippians 3:7 through 11. Now, I'm not going to read this out for the sake of the length of this video, but it's, whatever gain I had, I counted as a loss for the sake of Christ, and goes to becoming like him in his death, that if possible, I may attain the resurrection from the dead. I want to emphasize here, Lydia, not Perrin, that on the face of it, Philippians 3:7 through 11 is not at all Paul talking about what it was like for him to be called by God, or his experience of seeing Jesus risen. I literally have no idea why Perrin's bringing this in, except that it is part of his downgrading Paul's experience, even Paul's experience, to the level of kind of a sense of theological insight. All right, I'm going to return to Perrin. These excerpts from the letters of Paul are the most important passages in the New Testament from the standpoint of knowing what actually happened in the case of the resurrection of Jesus, because they are the only instances in which someone to whom the risen Jesus actually appeared talks about the event. It is clear from the evidence that the appearance stories are the heart of the matter, so far as the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is concerned, the appearance stories. We find such references already in 1 Corinthians and in connection with Paul himself, and we have seen that Mark deliberately suppresses any such stories, eye roll, for theological reasons of his own, so that the fact that the next such stories are found some 30 years later than 1 Corinthians and the Gospel of Matthew and Luke no longer surprises us. Also, we need not be surprised by the fact that the appearance stories in Matthew and Luke are difficult to reconcile with the list in 1 Corinthians 15, because we have not only to reckon with the telling and retelling of the stories over a period of some 30 years, but also with the intensive theological motivation of the evangelists Matthew and Luke, which, as we have seen, can most seriously affect their narratives. So the Christian who asks the modern question, what actually happened on that first Easter morning, must come to terms with the Apostle Paul. Paul is the one witness we have whom we can interrogate about his claim to have seen Jesus as risen, and our assumption has to be that if we could interrogate the other witnesses, their claims would be similar to his. Now, think about that. I want to comment, pause on that. He calls grabbing these sketchy and in some cases entirely theological statements just from the letters, just from the epistles of Paul. He calls that interrogating Paul about what actually happened to him. That's not it. That's not interrogating Paul about what actually happened. It's ridiculous. But that's because he's, insisting on sticking just to Paul's epistles, reminding us to ignore everything in Acts about what actually happened to Paul. And then he literally says that if we could interrogate the other witnesses, their claims would be similar to his. This is very important to the matter of Perrin essentially saying the winning number was 6. Something happened other than, that is not a set of experiences that support the resurrection. Because what Perrin has just said is that what we have in Paul is all we have as far as what Paul really experienced. And what he experienced was something he called seeing Jesus, but that was really not like what we find in Acts, not certainly like what we find in the Gospels, but was this kind of theological insight. He goes on, in some way, they were granted a vision of Jesus, but please remember that vision here doesn't even mean anything interesting, which convinced them that God had vindicated Jesus out of his death, and that therefore the death of Jesus was by no means the end of the impact of Jesus upon their lives and upon the world in which they lived. Very much to the contrary, since Jesus has risen, commissioned them to new tasks and to new responsibilities, they found confidence in themselves and in the future of the world in which they lived, precisely because they were responding to Jesus as risen, and because they were now living in a world in which Jesus was risen. If I personally were asked in connection with the resurrection of Jesus what actually happened, it is in these terms that I would reply. This sounds like one of the worst Easter sermons I ever heard, which was in an Episcopalian church in Nashville, where, heaven help me, I went to this church that I didn't usually go to on Easter Sunday morning for some reason, and the preacher said that the message of Easter was that we could all go home, because Jesus was risen, we could all go home and paint Easter eggs. Imagine that if you interrogated Peter, if you interrogated John, if you interrogated Thomas, okay, the disciples, what actually happened to you? They replied by saying, well, God was pleased to reveal his son to me. Jesus appeared to me, and whatever was gained to me, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. I became convinced that God vindicated Jesus out of his death, and that the death of Jesus was by no means the end of the impact of Jesus upon my life and upon the world in which I lived. And you interrogated them. You said, what actually happened? And they said, well, he appeared to me, I came to realize, etc. And even though you're interrogating them about what really happened, they're not saying anything. Basically, they're saying this kind of vague notion of appearing and having theological insight instead of what's found in the Gospels. Instead of even, well, it seemed like he was there and we were like talking to him over a long period of time and we ate with him and we all experienced this. He looked like he was right there in the room. No. Just a bald claim, he appeared. I saw him. And then all this theological stuff about his impact in the world. He was vindicated out of his death. I'm sorry, this is not even just an argument from silence. If you're pressing somebody to tell you what happened and what he means by saying that Jesus is risen, and this is what he gives you, the implicature is that this is the most that happened. That, nothing more vivid, more physical-like happened. You do not need to use hallucinations to explain this. You do not have to want to dismiss the appearances and therefore use hallucinations, much less group hallucinations. Heck, you don't even have to use individual hallucinations. What Perrin's describing here as what actually happened is something you can just explain, just like someone saying, I was sitting in church with my eyes closed and I saw Jesus. He showed himself to me, and I came to understand that he's working in me and in the world today, and that his death was not the end. It's just a theological feeling is all it is. Completely easy to explain naturalistically. If that's all that happened to them, that's evidence that he didn't rise from the dead. Because what are we going to say? Oh, he did physically rise from the dead, but then he hid himself off somewhere and didn't, appear to his disciples in any physical form, even though he rose physically? No. Okay? If all they experienced was this, and nothing any better than this, that's evidence against the bodily resurrection. If that's all that happened, that's the winning number is 6. Not the winning number is more than 5. And to call this the events themselves, you cannot deny that the events themselves actually occurred, is confusing. There is no the events themselves here that means anything that's helpful to the resurrection argument. Now, look, I think Perrin's out to lunch. Okay, I don't think he's any kind of authority on this at all. I think he's just completely wrong. But so completely wrong is he that he should not be cited as admitting something that is helpful to the resurrection case, because he isn't admitting something that is helpful to the resurrection case. We should just admit that a consensus of scholars, including liberal scholars, is not very helpful, or not helpful at all, to our resurrection case, and certainly the inclusion of Perrin is harmful to the resurrection case if the truth were known about what Perrin is actually saying, to give him any kind of standing, any kind of authority to this phrase. The late New Testament critic Norman Perrin puts it this way. There is no it that Perrin is putting, okay, that is helpful. Perrin's just talking about something completely different. He's talking about something that is completely contrary to anything that would be evidence for the Gospels. So just say Perrin is wrong. Don't bring him in. Don't use a quote from him, because when you put that quote in context of what he's really saying, it's very distinctly unhelpful. But there's this tick, there's this urge to have the evidence stated at some vague level and then say, well, at least they acknowledge this. And then to treat their different ideas as explanations of some univocal this, which is the evidence down here. No, the idea that they experienced only these sort of theological thoughts, which they called seeing Jesus, that's not an explanation of an appearance event. That's, in Perrin, it's a description of what he thinks the appearance event was. So there's no separate, if you evacuate all of that, you don't have an appearance event that Perrin is then explaining in some different way from the way we would explain it. You have a different event, okay? You don't have an event itself that we're all talking about. I really want to urge this, and once again, as I said, later in the post, Dr. Craig says, well, I haven't addressed yet whether the appearances were physical, and I have my own objections to the way he runs the argument at that point. He uses multiple attestation as what I call a knight on the white horse to come in and, kind of, so we don't have to argue that the Gospels are reliable and that they don't include made-up stories, but multiple attestation saves us from having to do that. I disagree with that. I'm not really getting into that today, and I also want to acknowledge that he, says that these earlier quotes, including the quote from Perrin, don't address whether the appearances were physical. Good. That's good as far as it goes, and it's less confusing than some things that Dr. Habermas does. But counting Perrin as part of a consensus that the appearance experiences happened, and then putting him into this context as if you'd have to invoke hallucinations to explain him away, And talking about him as acknowledging the events themselves is itself confusing and is itself a kind of unfortunate taking out of context of what Perrin is really saying. So this was a just pretty wild example. And when I came upon it the other day, I want to give a shout out here. Richard Porter, my friend, was reading some Perrin and drew my attention to it because Gary Habermas also cites Perrin as acknowledging the appearances. And so then I went and checked out Perrin's book on Open Library. So shout out to Richard. And my jaw was just dropping as to what Perrin's really talking about and how it's a completely easy to explain experience. It's not just that it's natural in his final conclusion, it's that the experience itself is very easy to explain, and in fact would be better explained without a supernatural event, much less Jesus' bodily resurrection. Okay, that's all for today. I hope you'll come back to the Lydia Midrood channel where we're making common sense rigorous.